Gavin Newsom has signed several bills concerning the use of artificial intelligence. AB 2839 lets courts impose penalties on people who make deceptive content with AI. AB 2655 makes large online platforms responsible for taking down or labeling deepfakes. AB 2355 requires political campaigns to disclose whether they've used artificial intelligence in their advertising. There's also two new laws that add protections for performers whose voices or likenesses have been duplicated by AI. Joining me now with more on AI technology and regulation is Dr. Greg McNeal, an expert in emerging technology, professor of law at public policy at Pepperdine University. Welcome back to ITI. Thanks for being with us.
Good to see you again.
It's great to talk to you, especially because we think about AI so often, and it feels like with this latest legislative session, there's a lot on Governor Gavin Newsom's desk. But before we get into these specific bills, let's just think about the regulation. And I talked about this with Scott Wiener too. Promise peril. Where are we with AI and regulation?
I think we're a little early for the peril, right? Like my sense on this is that we're taking
It's not too late.
No, I think my sense on it is we're taking the doomsday preppers approach to a regulation where sit around, hypothesize about all of the different horrors that might flow, and then let's legislate just in case, instead of waiting to see what actually might play out. Right. And the benefits are substantial on the technology. There's not yet been proven any harms, just speculative harms.
Speculative harms, and that's one of the things that SB 1047 is addressing or trying to address. Governor Gavin Newsom hasn't signed it yet, sitting on his desk. It's this idea about trying to prevent catastrophic harm on the back of these AI models. There's a lot to it, but just talk about how you view it and how people are viewing this bill.
So what's interesting is that the sponsor of the bill, who to his credit has talked to a lot of people in industry to try to improve the bill, is starting from this departure point that there are these catastrophic harms, but they're unknown. Therefore, we will shift the burden to these technology companies to certify that their large language and frontier models won't cause any catastrophic harm. But the harm's not defined. So it's left up for them to think of what the examples of those catastrophic harms might be.
Well, it's interesting you call it a burden because he says these are things, and by the way, he is Scott Wiener, state senator from the Bay Area who co-authored this bill. And he's saying these are things that these big tech companies have said they're going to do anyway. We're just making it obligatory through legislation. Is that a fair read on what he's doing?
I think that's a fair read, although that's always sort of the regulators' camel's nose under the tent, right? Which is where they'll start by saying, well, you've already agreed to do these things. Therefore, why don't we make it now a binding legal obligation? It's one thing if someone says they're going to do something on their own. It's a very different thing when the force of law comes behind it, because then you have to put in insurance and compliance teams. You have to hire people. That does become a burden on innovation.
It becomes a burden on innovation. It's interesting you bring that up because we did have Scott Wiener here on the show. I asked him about that very question, these counter arguments that include, hey, this is going to unnecessarily burden these companies and prohibit the innovation that California is known for. Here's a bit of that, and then we'll have your response to it. Let's take a listen.
This law only applies to AI developers that are spending more than $100 million to train their AI models. So we're talking about large companies. This bill does not apply to startups. It applies to the large companies, OpenAI, Google, Meta, Anthropic, Amazon, et cetera, companies that have all committed to perform this safety testing.
And maybe it won't surprise the people at home to know that many startups and smaller companies have supported the bill because it doesn't apply to them. What do you think about that argument that it won't stifle innovation? Because
I mean, the idea that only those who spend $100 million on training these models is just the large companies is a little disconnected from the state of where venture capital funding is at right now. I mean, there are many companies that are raising substantial hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars at multi-billion-dollar valuations. That's why you see, for example, Mark Andreessen from Andreessen Horowitz coming out in opposition to the bill.
Right. And also in support of the bill is Elon Musk. In support of the bill is Anthropic, which is a big company, OpenAI against it. What do we make of these supporters and detractors?
What do we make of the strangest bedfellows in the world, right? Nancy Pelosi and Mark Andreessen on one side and Elon Musk on the other side. There is a lot of nuance in there. I think if you start from the position that you believe that these models have the potential for harm, even if it's unspecified. It's a little bit of the Terminator sort of doomsday approach. You'll be in that camp with Elon Musk and others. And if you believe that innovation best happens the way it did on the internet, for example, in the 90s up till today, then you would want a light touch approach to not regulate, to allow the market to develop, to allow innovation to flourish. And so I think that's the two different sides of the perspective that we're seeing.
I see. And OpenAI has also said, look, this is going to lead to a patchwork. If the state does it, we don't mind regulation. It's just that it should come from Congress. Scott Wiener is saying, yeah, but they know Congress is just dragging their heels. They're never going to get it done. What do you make of all this argument?
Yeah, the patchwork argument is a pretty good one. The reason for that is if you just look, there are already 50 states that have, or there are 50 bills pending in states seeking to regulate AI. Hawaii's is even worse than the California one, basically saying you must prove for a fact the benefits of your technology before you even launch them. And so if these proliferate, like we've seen the privacy bills proliferate, there's really going to be a need for Congress to take action to try and harmonize things, or we will watch innovation be stifled.
Well, it's part of what we're talking about too, and Senator Scott Wiener has said, is like these companies saying that they're going to police themselves. Can we trust them to do that? This is in the social media realm, not in the AI realm, but recently Instagram said, look, we know that social media is a problem for kids, so we're going to take these accounts and make them private. Let alone the fact that kids are going to say, well, I'm 46 years old, so I'm fine, you know? So how do we—
Kids lie about those things?
Yeah, can you imagine? Can you believe it? But what do you think? I mean, how do we then place our trust, or do we, in these companies to police themselves?
So on the one hand, you have the idea that the companies will police themselves, will have no intervention whatsoever.
Right.
The other end of the spectrum is the California 1047 approach, which basically creates a group of California politically appointed bureaucrats to exercise oversight over companies. Probably also a bad idea on the other side of the spectrum.
And who are those people? I mean, people—
who are they going to be? Whoever donates the most to some campaign, right? So probably the best solution in between might be some form of industry self-regulation and self-certification across a set of industry consensus standards. That's very different than certification to a government authority.
And all this has always become this issue, and we see it in Congress. The sophistication of Congress, the sophistication of the bureaucrats to keep up with the technology is often lacking. So maybe these tech companies find a way to circumvent the sophistication of the bureaucrats, or maybe they just feel so stifled by having to explain themselves to these bureaucrats. So what are we seeing in Congress of this, and what about the sophistication argument that the legislators can't just keep up?
There is a sophistication argument. I think it's a very strong one. There's no reason for us, though, to believe that whoever donated the most money to someone's political campaign will end up being the most sophisticated bureaucrat either. And so when you look at, for example, why cell phones are so standardized and harmonized, it's because the cell phone makers have gotten together with a set of industry consensus standards to behave in a certain way. So you can imagine a regulatory model like that. I think when this gets to Governor Newsom's desk, he's going to have a difficult sort of decision to make. On balance, I think the politics are probably smarter for him to not weigh in right now and see how it plays out. And that's also true of the substantive part of it.
There is one bill that he did sign over the weekend about social media, trying to prevent feeds from being addictive for children. Of course, how do you define addictive? There's an issue with people who are adults maybe getting censored out of the content they want because they might be mistakenly thought to be teenagers. I mean, what do we make of this bill and how Newsom's doing with that?
Yeah, this is really challenging too, because the idea is that we want to regulate a harm here, the harm being that the technology is addictive. But when you go into the social science literature, you have researchers on both sides saying, is it addictive or is it just very interesting? It's compelling people to be interested in it. There's no diagnostic criteria for social media addiction, unlike a gambling addiction. So that's also another challenging area. I think part of the goal here that California is trying to do is to lean forward, regulate as much as possible, try and pull forward the other states and the federal government to act. That's something we saw California legislators do with the privacy law that California passed.
There's so much to unpack when it comes to these laws, define these terms. Dr. Greg McNeal, you do it well. No surprise, you teach this stuff. Thanks so much for being with us. Great to see you. Welcome back, and we'll talk again sometime soon. Hope so. All right, Dr. Greg McNeal talking about what's happening with AI, the state of regulation in our state and beyond. More coming up on ITI. Don't go anywhere.